While they took to the streets, the headquarters of the opposition party was raided by unidentified men. In this security video distributed by the opposition, which cannot be independently verified, what appears to be armed men forced their way in. This congresswoman, who was there at the time, describes the scene.
The men forced us to go down on our knees. They said they were looking for the national coordinator, Carlos Vecchio. They knocked down the door, they were armed and they left.
The government has turned up diplomatic pressure and nationalist sentiment by expelling 3 U.S. diplomats. President Nicolas Maduro accuses them of aiding groups that are trying to overthrow his government.
They will be forced to leave the sovereign and independent homeland of Venezuela in the next 48 hours because of actively participating in the organization and promotion of these groups which attempted to generate violence in the country.
The U.S. rejected the allegation, saying the country's political future is for the Venezuelan people to decide. But for many, the growing political tension is doing little to ease the financial crisis gripping the country. And for people like Andrea Patiño, it's getting harder and harder to support her family.
We can't find chicken, meat, milk, butter, oil, sugar or coffee. You can't find any basic products.
With the opposition refusing to give up and the government increasing pressure, there's no clear sign when, how, or even if this political crisis might end soon. Rachel Levin, Al Jazeera, Caracas, Venezuela.
Much to discuss here then. Let's bring in our guests to get their analysis on what's going on in Venezuela. In New York, we have Gregory Wilpert, a specialist on Venezuelan affairs and founder of VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Joining us from Caracas, Girish Gupta, a journalist covering events in Venezuela. And in St. Louis in the U.S., Daniel Hellinger, a professor at Webster University and author of the book Venezuelan Politics in the Chavez Era, Class, Polarization and Conflict. Girish Gupta, first of all, then, we are seeing headlines that suggest all of Venezuela is aflame, completely consumed by revolutionary turmoil. But can you perhaps put these demonstrations into some context for us?
Yeah, we are seeing flames, but they're not engulfing the whole country at all. We've seen protests across the country for about 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks now, and over the last 6 or 7 days they've hit Caracas, and they've hit Caracas hard. But as you say, it's not engulfing the city, it's not engulfing the country. It's very specific parts of the city, a region known as Chacao and Altamira, which is a wealthier part of town. And this is very telling because, yes, there are lots of people on the streets, but it's thousands. It's not tens of thousands. It's not hundreds of thousands. And those are the numbers that we saw over a decade ago when there was the short coup here. And that's why it's difficult to see that this will turn into something bigger. But then we do have this showdown today between the government and the opposition. We'll have to see how that goes.
Professor Hellinger, though, one opposition blogger wrote the following: middle-class protests in middle-class areas on middle-class themes by middle-class people are not a challenge to the Chavista power system. They're part of the Chavista power system. And there's also a suggestion that this is perhaps more of an opposition coup against itself. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that's a pretty good analysis because, you know, your reporter referred to the opposition, but in fact, Enrique Capriles, who was their candidate in the last election, and who himself has, I think, unwisely called people out into the streets, for example, after the election in April, this time is counseling a lot more moderation. And I keep in touch both with government and opposition figures in Venezuela, and a lot of people in the opposition are very distraught at the way in which the most extreme sectors of the opposition associated with the party that was raided, that your reporter referred to regarding the raid, that the more moderate sectors of the opposition, I think, are not at all happy that the more extreme sectors of the opposition are trying to provoke a crisis, which in the end will probably unify the supporters of the government.
Right, so let's run through then the key players in what's going on. Obviously, we have Nicolas Maduro, a one-time bus driver. He was elected president of Venezuela in April of last year. He was Hugo Chavez's hand-picked successor at the ballot box, but only scraped to victory by less than 2 percentage points. Leading the demonstrations with a call for the government's exit, Leopoldo Lopez, hardline leader within the opposition alliance, Harvard graduate. He's mobilized a section of the opposition, but is facing arrest on charges of murder, terrorism and conspiracy. And then the other important figure in the opposition movement, Enrique Capriles, who narrowly lost the presidency to Maduro. His support has been waning, though, among some protesters who've lost patience with his attempt to suggest a more moderate leadership. Gregory Wilpert, let's go through them, these different figures. Leopoldo Lopez, first of all. Who is he, and what's he trying to achieve? I mean, clearly he's called these protests La Salida, the exit. What's he trying to do here?
Well, first of all, I think he's trying to take advantage of the unhappiness that exists in the population with inflation and the shortages of basic products, as was mentioned in the earlier report. And so that's one of the things. The other factor is that, of course, he's also, in a sense, staging, as was mentioned earlier, also is staging an internal coup against the leadership of the opposition, trying to, so to speak, gain the upper hand by taking a leadership position without really consulting with them and without their participation. So I think that these things are coming together. Ultimately, as the blog analysis said, it's probably not going to succeed, and it's actually going to divide the opposition even more than it has been. So it's really I think a strategy that doesn't have much use for the opposition. But you know, the fact is that they are trying to take advantage of these economic problems that currently exist in Venezuela.
Professor Hellinger, though, is this purely, though, an argument about tactics, whether to respect the democratic process, the election, or not, or is it actually about policy? Enrique Capriles, the mainstream opposition leader, has certainly been trying to suggest he's a sort of Chavez light, that he will preserve many of Chavez's policies. Is that part of the fault line as well, though?
Well, it is part of the fault line, although I do think that I see a deeper problem here, which is the oil economy. I mean, the country still depends on oil for 95% of its export earnings. They're now consuming 800,000 barrels. They produce 3 million barrels a day. They're consuming 800,000 barrels a day themselves, producing it at a drastic loss. They're paying China in oil at 200,000 barrels a day of exports. That's all export earnings that are not available. And I do think that Maduro's economic team has not been a team. So the government side is kind of making things worse. But on the other hand, you know, this reminds me a little bit of what's going on in Thailand. You have a government, on the one hand, that is supported by the sectors of the population that in the past have been excluded, and they are a majority. They may be a slim majority after last April's election, but they're a majority. And then you have a middle class in Caracas that wants to paint the government, with some reason, as incompetent and not doing a very good job, and sort of suggesting, in a sense, campaigning against democracy. So it's eerily kind of like more like Thailand than like Ukraine, because the protesters in the streets really are the anti-democratic side.
Girish Gupta, though, it all suggests, though, that this is a bit of a gift to Nicolas Maduro, that he was facing pressure and trouble. And now I suppose he can just say, well, look, the right-wing oligarchs and everyone are up to their old tricks again. The anti-democratic oligarchs are up to their old tricks again. They're the enemy.
Well, that's right. Enrique Capriles was very smart in realizing that Hugo Chavez was liked by people in Venezuela, and that the opposition, to get anywhere, has to admit that and understand why that is. Now, Enrique Capriles, he may well be this oligarch. You know, his family owns a chain of cinemas here, for example. But he did understand that. He went into the slums. He would act like Chavez did. He would persuade them that, yes, you know, there was some good in Chavez, and I will continue that good, but this country isn't necessarily working as it should, and I can do better. Now, he didn't win 2 elections. He failed to win against Hugo Chavez by quite a wide margin, and then failed to win against Maduro last April by a very small margin. And that's meant that the opposition as a whole has begun, not totally, but has begun to lose interest in Enrique Capriles. And that's now when Leopoldo Lopez can come in, and this is the divide that you talk about. Leopoldo Lopez has come in, he's much more radical, and people are telling me, well, we want something to happen, and at least Leopoldo's getting people out on the streets. However, he doesn't necessarily understand that what people want, what some people want in this country, is a Hugo Chavez-like character.
But very quickly there, Greg Wilpert, is Leopoldo Lopez's gambit paying off? And anyway, did we actually buy that Enrique Capriles had become this Chavez-like figure, or was it just the same old backers backing him anyway? Was this kind of a political ploy?
Well, given that the election last April was so narrow, I think that many people did switch sides and ended up supporting Enrique Capriles, people who had previously supported Chavez. It still wasn't enough to win the election, but there was a significant switch. So the strategy did seem to work, which is also, I think, one of the reasons why Capriles is sticking to it. On the other hand, Leopoldo Lopez, he sees that his only hope, so to speak, as a leader to challenge Capriles is to engage in this more radical strategy.
Is it working, Greg?
And to some extent he's succeeding, in the sense that the government is certainly demonizing him, I think, by putting out an arrest warrant against him. And I mean, it's dividing the opposition, though. So that's the other factor. I mean, but it's putting him certainly on the map in terms of leadership of the opposition.
But Professor Hellinger, presumably the government must be aware that if there is any crackdown by the government, they'll lose any moral authority they may have, any democratic authority that they may have. I mean, the people who benefit from the violence would be Leopoldo Lopez, wouldn't they?
You know, you can see the ploy there. You know, he makes himself a martyr. There's a good prospect, again, there could be violence. As Greg points out, I think quite rightly, the government has done some kind of stupid things. I mean, it's almost like echoes of 2002 when the opposition tried to overthrow Chavez and the TV stations were cooperating and refusing to show pro-Chavez demonstrations. Now, all of a sudden, you've got the government, in a sense, trying to prevent local broadcasts of opposition demonstrations. This is very foolish because you really can't control the.
Yeah, but the opposition TV stations are still open, aren't they? Again, there's a Twitter kind of thing that all the TV stations have been shut down and so on. That's not true, is it?
Oh. No, that's not true. Yeah, right, you're absolutely right to point that out. I mean, there's sometimes particularly in the American news, we get an image of a country where there's no opposition and the media can't operate. I didn't mean to say that either.
Okay.
But at the same time, I do think the government is not responding in an entirely smart way to this challenge.
I'm glad you mentioned the U.S. You can never talk about Venezuelan politics without talking a little bit about the U.S. There is always this wider dimension of the U.S. After President Maduro expelled 3 U.S. diplomats, he accused them of conspiring with opposition hardliners to stage a coup. Justifying the expulsion, Maduro said, "We are determined to risk everything to defend peace, our independence and our democracy. Let them go and conspire in Washington and leave Venezuela alone." Reports of the arrests of anti-government protesters and the warrant issued for opposition figure Leopoldo Lopez drew this response from the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. He said he was alarmed, adding these actions have a chilling effect on citizens' rights to express their grievances peacefully. Greg Wilpert, how should we look at the U.S. role, given their history of involvement with the opposition, this strange balance between promoting democracy and actively funding the opposition? Where are they now, do we think?
Well, it's difficult to know for sure. Elias Hawa, the foreign minister, hasn't, as far as I know, released the most recent evidence that he says he has against these diplomats that are being expelled. So we don't know exactly what they're being accused of having done. But he presented it in the context of earlier WikiLeaks revelations that the U.S. Embassy has been meeting with opposition and has been funneling significant sums of money, millions of dollars, to the opposition. And then, of course, in the broader context of the Latin American left, there's extreme suspicion, of course, against the United States' involvement in Latin America in general. And so that's also the broader context in which one has to understand these actions. I think it's also a warning sign towards the United States to stay out of Venezuelan affairs, that even if what they were doing was relatively harmless, you better not get involved. And in a sense, it was a shot against Secretary Kerry's statements about, hoping to resolve things peacefully and so on, which in a sense was perceived as a further tacit support for the opposition.
Let's have a little bit more context then on a driver of opposition to Maduro, which Leopoldo Lopez is trying to exploit: the economy, clearly. Particularly inflation and shortages of goods, a major source of discontent. Let's run through some indicators here and place them in their historical context. First, inflation, which, as you can see, fluctuated widely before Chavez came to power, but was sharply reduced while he was in office. And even now, the rate of inflation is well below the highs before the Bolivarian revolution of Hugo Chavez. Another indicator, poverty, that's decreased significantly since 2003. This graph only goes up to 2011, but according to the UN, Venezuela had the largest drop in poverty anywhere in Latin America in 2012. One more indicator to look at, education. Here's how the number of graduates from higher education has increased. Professor Hellinger, clearly then, these are the statistics always trotted out, the amazing improvement in the social indicators. Clearly inflation is now very high once again, but there's this question as to whether the gains under Chavez, the social gains and some of the economic gains, are in jeopardy because Nicolas Maduro simply isn't up to the job.
I think, listen, I'm happy to be able to respond to a recitation of some of the good news about Venezuela, because it's usually the opposite that I have to do. At the same time, I have to point out again, they're making a mess of the oil sector, and the oil sector drives the economy. Now, I mean, the official exchange rate is still 6.3 to 1. That's the exchange rate they use to import foodstuffs. A year ago, the street rate was 20 to 1. Now it's 70 to 1. They really haven't gotten the exchange rate right. And the other problem is, just 6 months ago, the Minister of Oil said they were going to increase production of oil to 3.25 million barrels a day, and they're not even going to make what they made last year. It's not as bad as some of the international experts approach it. But I'm really worried because, again, the problem is there's more and more of a drain on dollars. People are buying dollars at 6.1 if they can, and the government is using the 6.1 rate to bring lots of imports into the country. They don't have the underlying production. So I don't think the economic crisis is an immediate one, but I do think it's getting closer and closer if they don't do something and get the oil policy right. They're not even being able, it's such a mess because it's almost impossible for even their own partners, the contracts they've signed, for them to operate in the fields now because they're not paying dividends. There's an Indian national company. We're not talking Exxon here. We're talking about the Indian National Oil Company has been waiting to be paid over $400 million in dividends that they have not been paid since 2008.
Girish Gupta, though, I mean, the plan remains the same. It was the same plan under Chavez. They diversify the economy, get it away from a speculative capitalist economy to a productive socialist economy, and so on. I mean, what's the leadership saying about this? There must be some recognition about this. I know there was a major speech last week.
The leadership does understand this problem. It's now admitting, I mean, that the black market rate's now up to 80 compared to the official rate of 6.3. That's about 14 times difference with respect to the US dollar. The government does understand this, and there was a semi-devaluation. Well, essentially, it was a devaluation a couple of weeks ago to about 11, and there are measures being taken, but it seems they just don't have the dollars to get this going. They're talking about these weekly auctions of about $220 million. The first didn't even take place. So there is concern here that, the rhetoric is there, but it's not actually happening. But
Greg Wilbert, what went so wrong after Chavez? Why this spike in inflation? Of course, there's always that left-wing critique that Chavez was never half as radical as he was presented to be. He always left the oligarchy, the elite, the rich in place, who are now making a lot of money, actually, through all of this. But what's gone so horribly wrong?
Well, there's really two explanations. One is that, I mean, the one that the government presents, which is that the opposition sectors, the private sector, has tried to take advantage of Chavez's death by waging what they're calling an economic war, by driving up prices and by speculating. I think that might be part of the reason, part of the explanation. But there's another explanation which is more kind of economic, that is that the fixed exchange rate that has been in place since 2003 has not kept, and this is something that Daniel Hellinger mentioned, has not been adjusted properly. And with the passing of Chavez, not enough dollars were made available, which caused a boom in the black market for dollars, which in turn fueled inflation.
Incompetence rather than ideology then? I mean, what's going on? Is it possible to put one's finger on it?
Well, it's really a combination of factors. I think that opposition sectors trying to take advantage of the economic problems, and of course, and a kind of a lack of reaction to a persistent economic issue, which is the fixed exchange rate, which hasn't been adjusted in a long time.
Professor Hellinger, we are beginning to run out of time, but I know you're clearly a specialist in the development of democracy in Latin America. There has been this enormous expansion of local democracy in Venezuela. What about discontent then amongst the base? Because clearly that will be a disaster for Maduro.
Well, I think there is going to be more discontent. I mean, one of the things that this radical side of the opposition may have accomplished is that they're going to increase the reliance of Maduro and the government upon the more radical sectors within Chavismo. Now, some of these radical sectors are simply civilians who have want to advance the revolution more quickly, but there also are elements that are armed within it, and they act independently, and they have no intention of letting Maduro or anybody in the government tell them what they're going to do. So Maduro's got a problem on that side too, and again, if the radical opposition wanted to sort of just stir things up more, well, they're probably doing a pretty good job of that, but it means a real tragedy for the country, and it's going to be even harder for Maduro, I think, to govern after this.
But Greg, any sign though, we've always heard rumors of factionalism in the leadership. Certainly when Chavez was on death's door, there seemed to be a lot of jockeying for power, but how do things stand? Where's the military in all this? Is it possible that Maduro might have some sort of internal coup, as is often, as we often read tweets about, well, we've always read tweets about?
Well, I think the situation would have to really deteriorate for that to happen. Right now, I think Maduro is still in a fairly comfortable position in terms of the unity of his movement. I think the opposition demonstrations, as I said before, aren't posing a real challenge. The economic problems are posing more of a challenge and they're trying to deal with them. But the situation in that sense hasn't deteriorated enough yet for anyone to see that as an opportunity within the government to challenge Maduro. So in that sense, I think they all recognize that unity, at least for now, is absolutely essential for the government to remain in power, and therefore there's not going to be a challenge unless the economic situation gets significantly worse.